let's discuss a little bit about some of the techniques. So we've figured out this 18,000 hours or 50,000 hours, but at the same time, we know that public education is wasting a lot of time, right? And I think that a lot of the rote memorization that education is normally taught in is possibly the most inefficient way of learning most things. Maybe there's a couple of exceptions out there, but I would say the majority of them, there's much better techniques. Let's talk about what those techniques might look like.
There are many levels at which we can discuss this. So I'd like to start at the macro level, and we need to be careful with our terms. And so I'll define the terms along the way. At its core, there are some skills that are necessary for success in modern life. There are some foundational skills. My basic framework for these skills I took from Naval, and it's his 5-part framework that we used to talk about: the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Now we talk about the 3 R's because they're still perfectly valid, of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Naval's framework that I've adopted as a pretty useful framework is that the 5 major basic skills of education are reading, writing, and arithmetic, coding, and persuasion. Now, there's other things that we could add to that, but I think that's a really good, useful framework to build, that we really want our children to be skilled with reading, writing, arithmetic, coding, and persuasion, because those are broadly applicable. We can use them in many different categories. Now, there are many ways that we can teach those skills, many ways that we can develop those skills. The next thing we have to ask is content important, or is knowledge important? There is a tendency that is common among many educational people, especially in kind of the homeschool world, to say, and in fact, I myself used to say this, to say that in today's world, we should be teaching skills and not content. After all, if I can say to my watch, "Hey Siri," or I can go to ChatGPT and I can ask it any question, then why do I need to memorize anything? If I want to know what the capital of Mongolia is, why not just simply go to the watch and ask it what the capital of Mongolia is? Why do I need to teach that? I have decided that it's fallacious to believe that just because information is available to us in today's world, that we don't need to teach content to our children. The book that persuaded me of that is a book by, I mentioned E.D. Hirsch earlier, his book called Why Knowledge Matters. And what I found so persuasive is that in order to learn effectively, you have to have a base level of knowledge and experience in the world. Because I think the most useful technique of thinking about what is learning is that learning is the science of connections. And so when we have a little piece of data, that little piece of data needs to be connected onto another piece of data, another concept, another idea, in order for us to retain it. So when you have a broad base of learning, then you're able to learn more effectively. And this is true in every discipline. Your children practice martial arts. When someone is a novice martial artist who doesn't know anything about various kinds of strikes or various kinds of techniques, a novice is enormously unprepared for learning new material. And so let's say you're dealing with something that's a basic strike of some kind. A coach might have to describe the mechanics of a basic strike multiple times before the novice is able to absorb the information of how a strike should be accomplished. But as skill and experience increases, then the coach can make a minor comment, and instantly the experienced student knows what needs to be corrected. It's true in a physical domain, and it's also true in academics. The people who learn the most effectively are those who know the most, because they have the most surface area onto which to connect new ideas. So I think we really need to teach content. We really need to teach knowledge. We really need to teach facts. And so we need to define, you used the term a moment ago, rote memorization. We need to define what we mean by that. And so it's important that children know things, because if you know things, then now you can learn more things. And all advanced learning has to be built onto a basic superstructure of knowledge. So if someone's interested in that more thoroughly, go and read the E.D. Hirsch book, Why Knowledge Matters. And he draws a powerful example from the US system, but more importantly, he draws a powerful example from the French system. And in the French educational system, for decades, we've had the world's greatest laboratory on the importance of knowledge. The French kindergarten system for young people was widely acknowledged as being an incredibly powerful system. And the French standard industrial government school system produced students who were broadly competent in a number of areas. Then, at last, the idea of individualized progressive education finally reached France. And France scrapped its standardized knowledge-based kindergarten system in favor of personalized education. And because the French are so good at collecting data, you can see in the data the absolute destruction of the French educational outcomes in terms of academic results. So I would urge anybody who thinks that knowledge is not important to consider some of the arguments. So I think that knowledge, knowing specific facts, is actually far more important today than it ever was. The person who's most effectively able to use advanced informational tools, such as access to competent web searches, access to good artificial intelligence and chat systems, we're living in a world in which the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So the smart, intelligent people who know a lot are able to use these tools more effectively than anybody else, and their knowledge base is increasing much, much faster because of what they know. Whereas students who don't know much, they literally don't even know the questions to ask because they don't know the vocabulary to use because they don't know anything. And then when the information tool gives them an answer, they don't know how to respond to it or how to integrate it. So I believe that knowledge is important, but just because we want to impart knowledge, it doesn't mean that we have to stuff it down our children's face like dry sawdust. And so this is what the industrial school system does, is it says knowledge is important. So what we're going to do is we're going to put all the knowledge that you need to have in a textbook, and we're going to ram it down your throat. That's not necessary. We can acquire knowledge very smoothly and indeed pleasurably with a little bit of thought. And we can have all of the benefits of being extremely knowledgeable, but many more benefits if we do it intelligently. So when we get to the world of building kind of an educational philosophy, there are many philosophies, but we can, for the usefulness of a framework, divide philosophies into three categories.
Okay, so before we get into philosophies, I want to make one example and one comment, because first of all, I think that you're absolutely bang on. Now, my example to also highlight exactly what you've said is people often look at me when I tell them that I read audiobooks or listen to audiobooks at extremely high speeds, and people don't believe it's possible or don't understand how it's possible. I listen to a lot of audiobooks at 3x speed. Now, how am I able to do that? Well, yes, I am very, very adept at processing audio information. Very, very strong. I absolutely learn very well, hence why I have a podcast, hence why, I like audiobooks. But more than that is that base of knowledge that you are mentioning. So let's take something like a typical business book, okay? I can absolutely listen to a business book at 3x and understand every single word, every single concept, no problem. I can repeat it back to you verbatim after listening to it. How am I able to do that? Because I've listened to over 1,000 business books in my life, So I have this massive amount of background on concepts on different practices in business, right? But let's take the exact same thing and let's say it was, I don't know, on auto mechanics or something like that. I don't know one thing about auto mechanics. And I am sure if you gave me some technical book on auto mechanics and you tried to put it at 3 times X, it would be complete garbledygook. I wouldn't understand any of it. I'd have to listen to it at normal speed, and then I would build up, and I'd listen to a second one and a 10th one and a 100th one and a 1000th one. But at some point, there would be that base of knowledge. But at the beginning, when you don't know the lexicon, when you don't know the vocabulary, when you don't know the concepts and the history and the culture and why things got there, none of it makes any sense. So you have to have that foundational information. So that's my number one, is my example to absolutely highlight what you're saying. Number two, and it's really getting into, what you just said at the end on the rote memorization, is that yes, it is important to know things, but how we learn them can be done in context. So as we mentioned before, I love traveling with my children. You love traveling with your children. We homeschool, world school, unschool, in my case, my kids. I took my kids to Armenia and Azerbaijan and Turkey and Georgia last year. Well, they got to learn the capitals of these countries by going to those countries, by, reading books about them and watching movies and understanding and going to museums and food, and all of the things happened in real time context by visiting. It wasn't, hey, let's sit down and for the next hour, I'm going to write out every country's capital, and you need to stare at a piece of paper and memorize it until it sinks into your brain. And if you miss it, you're going to get an F mark on a test. Like, that is not a good or an effective way. Yes, it works, but the efficiency of it is going to be so low opposed to actually learning it in context. So I think that, going back to your point, let's make sure that we define the terms. When I use something like rote memorization, it is that ramming it down their throat in the sawdust fashion, as you painted a picture for us. It is not hey, people don't need to know stuff because our Apple Watch or Google or ChatGPT is going to be able to tell us the information. We need to know it, but there's more efficient/effective ways of learning it.
Yeah. I'm running an experiment right now with my children's languages, trying to understand if it is helpful to study vocabulary in an isolated way, or if it's more efficient to learn all vocabulary in context. We know that it's more efficient to learn vocabulary in context. And the problem is finding the context. So I've generally, when introducing a new language, I've thought, it's useful. We know that doing things like studying word flashcards are helpful and a good way of gaining initial exposure to vocabulary. But it's kind of like eating sawdust. It's not super interesting. And so I've been running an experiment to say, instead of sitting down with flashcards to say red, green, blue, yellow, black in the foreign language and learning those with rote memorization, what if we just tossed out all word card study and we learned all of it in context, in the context of stories? Will that work? I don't yet have the results of my experiment, but what I can confidently say is anything that can be learned in context, just like any kind of vocabulary that can be learned in the context of a story, is more easily learned, more efficiently learned, and more powerfully learned as compared to isolated data that we try to stuff in with rote memorization.
Yeah, the retention of information and the ability to recall that information, I am absolutely sure you will find that if you learn in context, it will be much stronger. I'm going to make that a guarantee, I'd say. And I can't think of one example right now that is not going to be a true statement.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, I cut you off. Actually, hold on a second. Okay, so let's get back into the philosophies, because we went on a little bit of a tangent, but I think an important tangent, because it is good for even people who are learning today to have context of where this kind of things comes from. So let's get back into the philosophies. I think you said that there's 5 main philosophies.
Yeah. What I was going to say is, for usefulness, we could divide things into 3 categories to try to grapple with how would we go about imparting education? How would we go about facilitating education? Because education is not really something that you can give another person. It's something that we all have to get for ourselves. So I like to think about it in 3 contexts. So the first context is what I'm going to label as the textbook approach. And this is the standard industrial model of schooling, to say we're going to have a textbook. And we know that you need to know science. So here's an earth science textbook. And you need to know American history. So here's an American history textbook. And we just go through the lists and we have a set of textbooks. This is probably better than some other options. The great benefit of a textbook-based approach is you're going to be exposed to a lot of concepts, a lot of ideas. The challenge is, and the great benefit of a textbook approach is that you're going to be exposed to a whole body of knowledge in a systematic way. Textbook writers work really hard to figure out how do we present information in a systematic way. And so that's the textbook approach. Now,
okay, I'm going to interrupt you. I'm going to interrupt you after each one.
Okay, go ahead.
Do you use textbooks?
Yes. And I believe that everybody should use some textbooks.
That surprised me. So let's flesh that out a little bit. In what ways do you use textbooks, or you believe they should be used? And are they the cornerstone, or are they a reference to go back to give framework to things?
I'm glad it surprised you, because this is something that I have changed my opinion on. So I understand the surprise. When, for example, we were newly married, all I did was gripe and complain about textbooks. And I was like, my children will never see the inside of a textbook. Textbooks are awful. We shouldn't use textbooks.
I'm still at that point, by the way.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So
there's the bias from my side on this one.
Right. And I think that bias is right, because the key with all of these things that I'm going to lay out is, where does this fit? So I'll describe to you the first time I ever read a textbook. My experience with textbooks in high school and in college was that we would be assigned a textbook. We would often buy the textbook, and then we would never read it. And they would just assign pages from it. I never really understood it, but that was how it was. And it wasn't until I did my master's degree when I read a textbook. My master's degree is a Master's of Science in Financial Services, and I needed to do several advanced level accounting classes for it. And so they sent me an advanced accounting textbook, and I had jury duty. And so I went to jury duty with my accounting textbook. And over the course of a couple of days, I read 2/3 of it, and then I finished the last third of it. And I came away from that experience of having read a textbook from the front cover to the back cover. I came away from that experience saying, that was amazing. I feel like I understand accounting in a comprehensive way. The book was full of powerful illustrations that demonstrated things to me. I did some of the practice problems to make sure I was understanding the concepts. And I felt more confident when I walked into my accounting exam than I had ever felt confident walking into an exam in my life. And I discovered that was an amazing experience. Look how powerful that textbook was. And that was what started to change my philosophy on textbooks. So what I'd say is there are some subjects that are extremely well taught with textbooks. And there are some stages of learning where a textbook is the best way of acquiring a comprehensive set of data and learning on a subject. So an example of what works really well with textbooks, well, mathematics. Mathematics is perfectly adaptable to a textbook-based approach. And let me define the term textbook. What I mean is a systematic, concept by concept, building structure where in the context of a book or a series of books, you try to systematically build all of these concepts. So today, if I'm actually working on rebuilding some of my long lost mathematics skills, today I find an algebra textbook or a calculus textbook to be a powerful tool as an autodidact. I don't want to learn mathematics randomly and haphazardly. I want to build concept upon concept, do practice, make sure I understand that, move on, and I want to do it at my own pace. So this would be an example of a textbook that is where a textbook is really useful. And as an adult learner, I would use textbooks. Let's say that I myself wanted to go and make sure that I think about physics. And we'll get to the other categories, because I don't think textbooks exclusively or even textbooks first is the right approach in education. But as an adult learner, I'm going to go get myself a physics textbook, and I'm going to look through it, because it's going to give me an overview of the concepts. It's going to teach in a very systematic way this structured, systematic discipline. Now, what am I not going to use a textbook for? I'm not going to use a textbook to learn English. I'm not going to use a textbook to even study the humanities. I'm not going to use a textbook to study history, because those are not systematic, structured subjects where it's line upon line, precept upon precept. On the contrary, those are a tangled web of ideas, and you can basically just jump headfirst into those subjects anywhere that's convenient, and you can build on them. We might reference a textbook from time to time, but those are not good subjects for a textbook-based approach. And in addition, we need to think about the age of the learner. So at the moment with my children, there is exactly one textbook other than a math curriculum, which is not physical, which we're not using. Excuse me. There's one textbook that I'm using, but it's a textbook that is not written in that kind of comprehensive, structured way. On the contrary, it's written in a very narrative-based approach, but it is systematically covering, in this case, it's a human anatomy textbook. But I've worked very hard to find a textbook that I think is appropriate for a 10-year-old. So in the high school years is where I think textbooks become very important, but they should be built upon a deep narrative understanding of each subject of interest. And you use textbooks to make sure that your systematic understanding is comprehensive, is clear, and your frameworks and your concepts are neatly covered, and they're covered comprehensively to prepare you for relevant exams.
Well, I think this is an important point, and I will absolutely give you credit, because I think that mathematics absolutely makes sense. And I'm glad that you mentioned history, because I think that history absolutely does not make sense for a textbook. And I've looked at history textbooks, and I'm a massive reader of history books and biographies and autobiographies. And I can tell you that history comes alive through stories. And if you want to destroy a story, put it in a textbook, because that it'll absolutely take all of the fun out of history. And it is absolutely, for me, one of the most enjoyable subjects or things to study or learn or build up a base of knowledge from. But for that, you need to read accounts and people who were there, people who studied it. It has to be done in such a different way than you are going to learn mathematics, for sure.
Right, right. So let me lay out these other two categories, and you'll see where I think we need to think about them. So
Sure.
On the one extreme that I began with is what I called a textbook, purely textbook curriculum. And there are many curricula available like this. Now, on the other hand, on the other extreme, we could have what I'll call genuine, hardcore, radical unschooling. And if we went unschooling itself is a term that is hard to define, because every expression of unschooling is unique. And a lot of people say I'm unschooling primarily because they're repulsed by the philosophy of industrial schooling, but they're not actually not doing anything, right? So I think you're a clear example of this. It's not like you don't pay any attention to anything. You're just not imposing an industrial curriculum, sit in the desk, read these pages, you have to do this every single day type of learning environment. So at its extreme, the unschooling philosophy, and I'm not, to be clear, I'm not against unschooling. I have studied unschooling quite a lot, and I'm inspired by many aspects of unschooling. But what I'll call unschooling, or what in this context, what I mean is exclusively interest-based pursuits, interest-based studying, no forcing or requiring of read this book, do this exercise, etc. It's purely interest-based, and the pathway through is haphazard. And so if you read an experienced unschooler's book, I could look up the title if you need it, but I read a great one last year by a Canadian unschooler, and it was called Unschooling to College. And she kind of went over this, and basically her idea was that children should follow their interests exclusively, and it's perfectly fine for them to have a haphazard introduction to a subject. So if they run into this subject and they don't have the prerequisites, they'll figure it out themselves. And I think unschooling fits really beautifully with some things, but in my mind, it doesn't fit beautifully with all things. I want to be a well-educated man. That is a goal of mine. I want to be a polymath. I'm an autodidact, but I want to be well-educated. And well-educated doesn't mean world-class in only one area. So I found this years ago when all I read were business books, and I wanted to get rich. And so all I read were business books. And like you described, you can have a great understanding of business, but then you turn around and you say, I don't really have a context for world affairs or for history. Where do we come from? Where are we going? Or I don't have a context for these things. So a well-educated man, I think, is one who has a basic familiarity with most of the modern branches of knowledge that are relevant to our lives. We're never going to be comprehensively familiar with all of these areas because the amount of sheer knowledge in our world is growing consistently. But in order for us to have that basic foundation that allows us to be competent at learning when we need to have more advanced education, we want to have a broad exposure to different areas. And so I don't want my children's education to be haphazard. Now, I want to defend unschoolers. I think the best, so I think of all philosophies of education, unschooling is the hardest to do, because the world's greatest unschoolers take this responsibility of eliminating the haphazard encountering with information very seriously. And they are forever dedicated to going out and finding resources and finding things for their children to haphazardly or spontaneously run into, because they care about this. Unschooling can either be one of the world's greatest expressions, but it's really hard to do, or it can be simply child neglect at its worst expression. And if a child has exposure to resources and an adult to mentor, it can work really well, but it can be difficult because when a child has exclusively haphazard exposure to the world, he or she may be missing that basic foundation that is common to the culture. And I've read a lot of stories of unschoolers because of my interest in these topics. And some of them appreciate many aspects of their education, but they often feel quite isolated from the common knowledge. And there is a base of common knowledge that when we have it, we become functional in society. And when we don't have it, it can lead to enormous lacks of self-confidence because we recognize that I don't know the things that other people know. I don't have the common knowledge. And it can lead to inability to progress to one's capacity. So those are kind of two extremes. And while we'll draw from them, for example, I think we can and should make a list of subjects that for which unschooling is entirely appropriate. And a lot of times these subjects would be very informative. So I'll give it some examples from my own life. I dabbled when I was a child. I dabbled in leather working for a time. I was walking through a store with my parents and somebody was selling a leather carving set. I'm like, that is cool. And my parents bought me the set and I played with it. I played with it for a few months and then I moved on. I dabbled in amateur radio. I was an amateur radio operator and that was an interest of mine. I've dabbled in lots of things. And what we want to encourage is we want to encourage dabbling, because all of this starts to build a broad general base of knowledge and understanding, and we can't predict how these things will come into play in the future. But I think it would be silly to say that leatherworking is a core fundamental subject that a well-educated child has to know. So we want to encourage and give lots of time for interest-based learning, and we want to surround a child with resources, but we want to make sure that the child is not missing something that we consider to be truly important.
I think that makes perfect sense. And I would say that we probably follow close to an unschooling because it is very much an interest-based learning. But, however, I believe in reading, writing, and arithmetic at high levels. And I would add to that list is communication. You described it as persuasion, but I think that they're quite similar. I think if we can get into the granularity of it, that for me is a non-negotiable. I think that absolutely my daughter and, my boys will need to learn to read at a very high level. And I think that with that, they then have the building blocks, the tools to then go and do a lot of the interest-based learning because they know how to to study and to focus and to sit down and where to find the resources and how to consume it and all of these types of things. And if they miss that learning how to read or read at a high level, they're not going to be able to do everything else. So it's a unschooling, but with caveats for sure.
Right. And this, we also want to put on the lens of age and progression in terms of where someone is in his or her career. So we may, so I think that when young, there should be huge amounts of liberty and modest amounts of structure, very low requirements on a student's activities, because there's not any need. Children are naturally curious about lots of things. And so unschooling is super important. In fact, that's what it is. At 4 years old, all you're doing is unschooling. You're reading to your child lots and you're going with interests and you're exposing things, but you're not saying you're going to be an artist, so do this picture according to this structure. As a child gets older, and let's say now we're dealing with someone of adolescence and teenage years, then in this context, it would be very appropriate, in my mind, to help the child to develop and plan for the accomplishment of his or her career goals, his or her ambitions with business and other areas. In addition, we also need to comply with whatever legal requirements are on us. I understand that some unschoolers resist dramatically at this point, but this is where it seems to me very appropriate that we say, what are your goals? And let's lay out a structure. And of course, it shouldn't be, especially in the teenage years, it's not me dictating and saying, you have to study this in this structure, but rather working with you. But what we're going to ultimately build is a program of education that is not haphazard. And it's going to be driven by interest and desire and ambition and goals. And it's going to be individualized, but it's not going to be haphazard.
So you had mentioned at first, philosophy number 1, textbook. Philosophy number 3, interest-based learning. Is philosophy 2 the combination of them, or is this a completely different leg of the stool?
So I would say philosophy 2 is basically an intelligently designed program of education that is not sawdust, but that does expose a child systematically to the different areas that he should be exposed to. And there are a number of people who are many educational theorists who have been involved in this. And this, I think, is the most fruitful area of discussion, because there are many ways that we could do it. So I think the most popular version of this is Montessori education, Montessori-based education, where Montessori educators are very highly trained and they're working to respect the individuality of the child and the interests of the child, but they are taking a child through a systematic curriculum. I have found enormous inspiration in the work of the 19th century British educator named Charlotte Mason.
Sure.
I have studied as broadly as I'm capable educational philosophies. And I consider a Charlotte Mason style of education to be the most inspired. It is the gold standard to which I hold everything else. I'm willing to abandon a Charlotte Mason style education if I can find something that is superior. But in my studies of trying to find it, I think that's the gold standard. And so what we can do is we can understand how does it gain from some of the pros and cons of each of these categories. And I can't in this context articulate comprehensively what is a Charlotte Mason education. It's actually a quite involved, comprehensive philosophy with many different components. But what I'll just try to offer to whet the appetite of any interested listener is to say, how do we deal with a subject? So you mentioned earlier the importance of story. Charlotte Mason coined a term that she called living books. And a living book is available for any subject, but a living book has a few basic characteristics. They vary based upon the subject, but there are some characteristics of a living book. So first of all, a living book is a book that is written by someone who is an absolute expert in his or her field, and somebody who has an enormous amount of enthusiasm and passion for the field that he or she is talking about. And I believe that this is fundamental because the world's greatest teachers what they do most effectively is they impart enthusiasm for the subject that they're teaching. They're enthusiastic about the subject, and then they're able to impart that enthusiasm to the students. And I love studying under this kind of teacher. This kind of teacher can can bring something that would have seemed totally boring, but I can absorb that enthusiasm. It's almost sales as a transfer of enthusiasm that you're selling the subject. And so you try to find a book that is written, or a resource in some cases, but generally a book. We're talking about books. A book that is written by somebody who has an enormous enthusiasm for the subject. Number two, you look for someone who's able to articulate the subject in the form of narrative. If at all possible, you want narrative. Humans are storytelling creatures. We understand in the form of narrative. Jesus, the most influential man in the history of mankind, spoke and taught with story, with parable. And anytime we can tell a story to convey something, it's going to be very, very sticky. And so we want to use narrative, if at all possible, in order to convey an idea. And we want the passion and enthusiasm for the subject to be conveyed in a way that is respectful of the child. We don't ever want to talk down to the child. Rather, we want to lift the child up and invite the child in to the rich buffet of ideas that are available to him to access if he wants them. And so in a Charlotte Mason philosophy, what we talk about is the spreading the delightful feast. And the idea is we're not going to make you come in and eat sawdust. We're going to find, for every subject that we think needs to be covered, we're going to find the most appetizing, tantalizing, attractive version of that. And we're going to offer that to you and say, why don't you partake of this dish? Why don't you try this dish? And then we're going to systematically continue to offer it to you in a structured way so that your tastes can grow over time. My fear with an exclusively I don't want to say that because that's not accurate. My fear with some expressions of a hands-off style of education is that the tastes of the learner don't mature because the learner has never really been exposed to excellence. But if you've been exposed to excellence, you can develop sophisticated tastes for learning, and that itself leads you on to a much stronger expression of it. And so this to me is what I do, what I practice, and what I think is the gold standard for how we handle it. And what we want to do is we want to make the work, and there's all kinds of other layers that we can level on in terms of effective learning philosophy. How do we effectively learn? What are the tools that we use? Because it's not all books, and it changes based upon a subject. But this to me is the gold standard of how we integrate these things. And so I want to lay out a delightful, delectable feast of ideas in front of my children. I want to interact with them on those ideas, talk about those ideas, see their application. I want to find the world's greatest experts to articulate these ideas. And I want them to engage with a passion for the idea. And then as they develop that passion, then when necessary, we can introduce the textbooks to supplement something that may have been missed in our purely narrative approach. I don't think it's strictly necessary, but I think it can be useful in some cases. And I want to encourage a broad exposure to help the learner to develop sophisticated, advanced tastes for what really high-level food tastes like and what really good, engaging learning feels like.
Well, and in today's day and age, the ability and the access of knowledge and resources and people is higher than it has ever been in human history. And so what you're describing of a list of books, for example, can absolutely be curated and has been curated already. And it is out there. That doesn't matter on your background or which country you're coming from or your socio-demographics or anything like that, that these resources exist out there for you and your family right now, today, if you pick them up. Like it's literally right there. And it's just so interesting to me that even though we know that there are such better ways of going about this, so many people will not do it. So many people will not sit down at the table and have a feast of these things. They will shirk responsibility, and it will all be passed to a professional teacher in a state-run school. And I just think that it's so sad. And I think that every opportunity is there. And it's just like, I really hope that you guys listen to this and are inspired and encouraged and empowered, that you realize that you absolutely can do this. Because I also know that these lists exist, because when you were here, Joshua, in January, you gave me some of the lists and I went through it and I was like, cool. I want to read these books. I want to go into these types of things, let alone for my child. And it was just like, I was inspired by that conversation we had together.
Yeah, it is. And I have a hobby of book lists. Actually, I collect them anywhere I can find them, of recommended book lists. And it's interesting to look at and compare them. But we're living in a golden age of information. And I'm convinced what we see happening in society is we're going to see an enormous separation of the classes and of culture. That, again, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Now, anybody can cross this divide. It takes some work. It takes some starting. You got to build some basic skills and build it. But the information is available. What's necessary is the inspiration to go and look for the ideas and start to develop them. And we haven't touched on, and I think for time we may not be able to, but we also need to think about our learning and make a very informed decision based upon modern learning science. And so one of my real passions for the last couple of years has been digging into learning science. And I'll give you one example of how this has changed my own philosophy. The example is, the story is testing. So again, 10 years ago, I would tell my wife, I'm like, we're not doing tests. I don't see the point in tests. I don't see the point in it. As far as I'm concerned, or was concerned, the only point of a test is that if a teacher has too many students in his or her classroom, then he has to administer a test so that he can understand, well, who's getting it and who's not. And my idea was always, well, I know whether my student is getting it or not because I'm very close to it. So what's the point of testing? So for the first 4 years of my homeschool, I did no tests, none at all. Then I started studying learning science, and I discovered that one of the most powerful, proven techniques to learn things effectively is testing. And I'll give you one story of an experiment that was run in order to demonstrate this. I'm directionally correct, but I don't remember the specific details on this. I could cite it, but so just go with broad strokes for me. What they did is they brought a group of research subjects into a laboratory, and they split them into two groups, and they gave them a passage of information, something to read on something like dolphins. And they gave group A this passage of information, and they said, read this information on dolphins. And they gave them 10 minutes to read it, or an amount of time to read the information. Then they had a short break, and they came back and they gave them the same sheet of paper and the same information on dolphins to read again. Then they had a short break, and they came back and they gave them the same information the third time. And then after the third time, they had a short break and they did a test to see how much of this information that you've studied on dolphins do you remember. Then I think they came back 1 week later and they gave them another test to see how much of this information did you retain 1 week later. Group B, excuse me, Group B, they treated differently. So Group B, they came in, they gave them the passage of information on dolphins, and they read it. Then they had a break, and they came back and they gave them a test on the information. Then they had a break. They came back and they gave them another test on the information. Then they came back and they gave them the same test on the information that Group A had gotten after 3 readings. Then 1 week later, they came back and they gave them a test. Now, what's fascinating, most of us, I would think, would expect that Group A that got to reread the information 3 times would do better on the test. Isn't that the expectation you would have, Mikkel?
Sure, of course.
So they did. On the first test, Group A did a tiny bit better than Group B, the group that had been tested all the time. They did a little bit better on the first test. 1 week later, however, on the retest, Group A had horrible performance on the test, and Group B had really good performance on the test. And they've demonstrated this multiple times in multiple ways and shown that if you want to really know something, it's actually more important for you to simply be tested on it than for you to spend more time reviewing it. And so I've dramatically changed how I approach education, and I have brought tests in, but tests are part of the learning pedagogy. They're not, I don't care about the score. In fact, I don't care at all about the score. What I care about is being forced to recall it. And what's interesting, there's applications of it in the learning sciences. Free recall, doing free recall or other testing methodologies is very commonly done. And so what I think is so excited about the world that we live in is there's never been before more freedom to people like you and I, where I can do whatever I want from an educational perspective. There's never been more access to great information and great teaching resources. And there's also never been more access than there is today to really high quality research that has been done into pedagogy, into helping people to do deliberate practice and to do active recall and to engage in interleaving, which is a really powerful technique that we want to do. And so what I think, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to bring all this research in and see if we can do better. Because what's shocking to me is if you look at virtually any field of human endeavor over about the last 50 years, we are seeing an enormous improvement in the level of human accomplishment. A simple example, if you went to a Suzuki method violin school and you grabbed a group of 6-year-olds who've been in the Suzuki method for a short time, doing a public performance. If you went back 300 years, those children would be considered prodigies. They would be considered to have some kind of incredible innate talent that was worth everyone talking about and them going on tour. That's just a standard Suzuki method class. If you go and you look at athletic times, today, 50 years ago, a world record in many athletic disciplines is today a standard good quality performance from a high school athlete, from a good high school athlete. Where I don't see this has happened is in how we educate children. We've added years onto the educational process. We've increased the number of hours of school enormously, but I can't find any evidence that we have increased the educational outcomes that our students are getting compared to what they were getting a century ago. And to me, this is a shocking indictment of the industrial school system as it is, and we've got to change this. And so this is a great passion for me. I'm doing my best. But I want to build communities of people talking about this, just like we're doing, sharing what's working, what's not. Things like we touched on language learning. Right now, my 10-year-old is doing school in 7 languages every day, fluent in 4 or 5 of them. The others are kind of at a learning stage. And it's not been that difficult. And this is at 10 years old. It's been pretty easy, actually. But it's been pretty easy because I stumbled into some techniques that made it relatively easy. So now I go and I look at the standard system where a child comes out of Spanish 2 in high school and can string together 7 words barely. And it's shocking how bad it is. So I don't want to complain against the system. What I want is smart, intelligent people with resources of time and money and interest. We need to build educational models that will help our children to flourish in the 21st century, because we feel that tidal wave rolling under society and transforming it systematically. And a lot of us, we're not sure what to do, but we need to build some new models to help young people to flourish and succeed in a new world.
Well, a book recommendation for you, perhaps you have read it, is A Mind for Numbers, because what you described in Group A is basically spaced repetition. And what you described in Group B is active recall. And she describes both of these techniques in the book, and it's really phenomenal. Her entire PhD was on short-term memory and long-term memory and active recall, active memory, which she calls working memory. And it's just a fascinating book. And I remember taking courses from her on learning how to learn. And it was one of the first things that I did 20 years ago or 15 years ago was get really serious about the most efficient and the most effective methods for learning, not just high volumes of information and knowledge, but really comprehending it and using it to build mental models that I can then create my life, my business, my family, my relationships from. And I think that people absolutely should be encouraged to spend a bit of time on the front end, figuring out what those are and then implementing them, because all of the other study that will happen on the back end becomes drastically easier once you understand these things.
Absolutely. That's probably Barbara Oakley? I haven't read that,
Barbara
but I have
Oakley.
another.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
I have
could
another book
remember.
of
Yeah.
hers.
Yeah.
Yeah,
She's done
excellent.
some amazing work and well worth following a lot of her discoveries in the form of learning.
Yeah, I had 18 years of formal schooling. Never once did I have even a single class session on how to study or on how to learn. And so 100%, like this is the foundation. With very young students, I think we should just model it and put them in an environment where they're learning in an optimal way. But by the time we reach, call it middle grades, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, a continual practice of the science of learning is really important. I'll just share just another idea. I recently have been trying to learn about genius and high levels of accomplishment. It started when I read a book called Peak by Anders Ericsson. I followed that up with reading the book called Talent is Overrated by Jeff Colvin. And then I'm just finishing a book called Range by David Epstein, which is kind of the rebuttal to those books. But what was amazing to me about Peak, especially, which really sparked my interest, Anders Ericsson was a researcher who dedicated his life to studying genius and his career to studying genius. And he has gone and studied every field that he could find of high performance. And what he discovered at the end of his career, his capstone book, this book Peak, written to a popular audience, is in essence, all high performance can be explained by two factors. Factor number one is the continual exercise of deliberate practice, which means something very specific, which I'm not going to define now. And number two, sufficient amounts of time. So sufficient amounts of time. It was actually some of the early work of Anders Ericsson, one of his studies of violin students at a violin conservatory in Europe, that Malcolm Gladwell drew for the idea of the 10,000 hours principle. And how Gladwell presented it was not quite accurate, but it was useful to say that if I do this thing for a sufficient amounts of time, I can achieve mastery at it. And here's Ericsson at the end of his career, of his academic career, saying, I've studied genius after genius after genius, and I'm going to tell you that anybody can achieve genius level performance in almost anything. And there's amazing stories associated with it to demonstrate that. And I find that both awe-inspiring and also fear-inspiring because awe-inspiring that I can achieve this. And I teach my children, I'll teach anybody that you can become a genius level performer in anything that you're interested in if you'll engage in the right form of deliberate practice over a sufficient amount of time. And we can do that with our students. We have we need to take a responsibility to help them, to equip them, to help them discover and uncover areas of interest that will then become areas of genius. And the concept of innate ability or innate talent, to the extent that it exists at all, it is highly overrated in the long-term performance. And that makes our responsibility as parents and as teachers much higher, because we can help our students to achieve at a higher level faster with the right environment and the right deliberate practice.
Well, I have a working theory, and I think I've described it to you, but I'm going to describe it again, and I'm very curious your thought process on this. And it goes something like this. As I said, it's a working theory, but basically, with a lot of children, what ends up happening is they show a very minuscule aptitude for something. Maybe it's academics, maybe it's sports or violin or something like this. But just this small, little, tiny touch where they get praise, okay? And they get told by someone that they're very good at this, or they can see that it making sense a little bit faster than their peers. And because of such, they will spend more time practicing it. And because they spend more time practicing it, not only do they get better at it, but more people notice. So you have more positive reinforcements, which then takes coaches and professionals and parents investing more of their time, energy, and resources into the child in that. And over a month span or 6 months or a year, you don't really notice it, but you certainly notice it over a decade, let's say. And it's that extra amount of time and deliberate practice and coaching that really goes into shape a lot of this world-class behavior. Now, is it because they have this innate ability? Yes and no. It is in that there was a small spark, but it's one fraction of 1% better than everyone else. It's not the end result, which is 1,000 times better than anybody else. And I have seen it in my own life. I have seen it in my children's life. And I've seen it in just 1,000 examples all around me where it's, everybody wants to discount someone's, career of doing something and just put it down to genetics or blood or luck or God or something like this. And I think it's there, but it's just so minuscule. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree with your working theory. I wouldn't try to present any evidence against it. In fact, a story in favor of it is I think it's applicable in almost every area of endeavor. And I can see it even in my own life. First, on a practical matter, a very practical thing that parents can do is, in order to inspire this, so if you are the parent of boys, one of the most important parenting things you can do is you should almost certainly hold your son back 1 year. Hold him back at the beginning and don't push him into the standard academic system at the same rate that you do your daughters. Because the developmental pathway, the process that boys proceed at is slightly slower. But you'll have two boys that are on a team, and one of them is just a little bit bigger, and he will demonstrate, they'll be going out to play baseball, and he's a little bit bigger, so he's a little bit better than the other boy who's 4 months behind him. And so all of that praise and accolades are heaped on his shoulders, and he finds himself wanting to do more of it because he's been praised at it. So this is applicable in many areas. And so you want to position your children to succeed. And for many reasons, a practical thing that we can do is hold your boys back 1 year and then have them go through the standard schedule, and they are much more likely to perform well. Just a story from my own life. I'm fat. I've been obese most of my life, sometimes more obese, sometimes less obese, sometimes a little bit fat, more fat. It's been a continual annoyance and frustration for me. One of my biggest fears as a parent is having fat children. And my wife is not fat, my children are not fat. But I was talking with a friend of mine who's a physical trainer recently, and we were talking about this. And he said, here's what you need to understand. He said that children who are taught how to move and children who move a lot move because moving feels good. And so physically, moving feels good. But if children are not taught how to move, and especially if they're fat or they're awkward or something like that, then moving doesn't feel good. And so they naturally don't move very much. And because it doesn't feel good, and we want to do more of what feels good. And so even on just the physical level of who becomes an athletic person versus who becomes a non-athlete, who becomes athletic and strong and supple and all that, and who becomes fat and lazy, a lot of that goes back to, did it feel good for you when you moved, and did you do more of it? And so if you observe that a child doesn't move a lot because he or she is fat or awkward, you need to engage in training to make movement feel good, and you can adapt to that movement. And then as it feels good, child does more of it. And then naturally that starts you on this different trajectory towards being ultimately what we call athletic. And this, I think, is true in everything. I'm not an experienced math teacher, but people say, well, I'm not good at math. My question is, how do you know that? Have you really started and had individualized instruction? Have you really done it with good teaching and built mastery in this subject? I don't see any evidence that, even proclivities, I don't see any evidence that you can't master something, you can't learn something if you're interested in it enough to do the process. And this is why even math is kind of the famous example. We can find so many people who went through all of their industrial schooling and were convinced, I'm not good at math. And then later they get out and they start looking at math themselves, and they have the ability to go at their own pace, and they discover, I actually love math and I'm really good at math. There's nothing fundamentally flawed or broken or biologically wrong in the vast majority of cases. I'm not going to deny learning disabilities, or I don't know enough about it. But broadly speaking, in the normal spectrum, it's mostly a matter of structure. And what I would say is that one of the reasons I'm so passionate about home education is because it's the most intensely personalized effect. Earlier, you talked about teachers. We need trained teachers in society. Trained teachers have training on how to manage classrooms of people. If you tossed me in a third grade classroom of 30 students, I wouldn't have a clue what to do because I'm not a trained teacher. I don't know classroom management. But most of education is not about classroom management. It's about coaching someone and bringing resources in front of it. And so homeschoolers, even homeschoolers whose parents were thoroughly uneducated, homeschoolers routinely outperform by a significant margin on standardized tests students that go through the standard government and industrial school systems. Why? Well, I think there's two key factors. Number one, generally speaking, home educated students in whatever discipline have individualized attention. It may be one-on-one, it may be two-on-one or three-on-one, but you have individualized attention from adults. And those adults, in the natural way that we do, understand, hey, you're struggling here, let me help you with that. And that individualized attention is priceless. And then the second thing is because they're not in the forced cohort at every level, they can proceed in a developmentally appropriate way. I have with one of my children, he's a boy, and my eldest, and his writing skills a year ago were horrific. He was literally reading at a college master's degree level in English and couldn't write as well as many first graders.
Now, you're speaking about handwriting, or you're talking about writing as in a story or something like that?
The physical act of using a pencil or pen and putting letters on paper.
Okay.
He had a pencil allergy, which is common among boys. They don't like to write. They don't want to write.
Mine's complete chicken scratch, like just the ugliest, worst ever. But I type 100 words a minute, so I make up for it in other ways.
So if a child like that is in, say, a first grade classroom or a third grade or whatever it was, then what's going to happen? Well, you're not allowed to read the advanced texts because those are too advanced for you. We've got to read these third grade classrooms. And the boy's sitting there bored out of his mind. That was how I was whenever I was in the industrial school system. I can read, I can look at the page, I can absorb all the information on the page in a few seconds, and I'm done. And it's like, why are we sitting here wasting our time? But then you can't write at a third grade level. You're writing at a first grade level, so you need remedial instruction in writing. In a home education environment, what I do is I customize the education. And so we push the reading right to the limit. And so you're reading at your absolute limit of where you're capable. So you're always getting better there. And then we pull back and we provide specific instruction on the writing to help you build the skills, build the strength, build the motor skills, etc. So that is what's so powerful about homeschooling is you have individualized instruction and you have a personalized path of advancement that allows you to be right at that efficient frontier of learning in whatever the skill is.
It makes perfect sense. And I always try to visualize a wheel because you have the spokes on the wheel and we want to make the wheel roll as efficiently as possible. So we need to bring up some skills, but that doesn't mean at the detriment of holding back, other ones from growing. Yes, it's important that it rolls, but not stifling. And definitely that's what happens in public education.